So Matt, have you ever been to beautiful desert lands of North Africa?
I haven't actually. I did go to Jordan in November,
Completely
which
different
is
continent.
well, it's part of that same kind of cultural strip. There is, there is cultural continuity across it, but no, um, Jordan and the Middle East is as close as I've got to to that part of the world.
Never been to, Marrakesh or Tunis.
No, I was chatting to a friend of mine actually. He went across the Straits of Gibraltar to Morocco and had a lovely time.
Mhm.
But no, I've never had the pleasure. Have you?
No, I have never been because I grew up in a culture where your holidays were to the white and the Irish and English parts of Spain. So I've never been to North Africa, although I would love to go sometime. But
All of my childhood holidays were taken in caravans, and of course, although there is a grand caravanning tradition across the deserts of North Africa, my dad's little 1980s Monza towed by his Volvo estate wouldn't have made short shrift. I don't think.
yeah, the closest I ever got was going on holiday to the Canary Islands, but that's about it. But
Wow.
speaking of caravans, you're very welcome to Beneath Skin, the show about the history of everything, told through the history of tattooing. I am one of your co-hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I'm joined as ever by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder. Matt, what are we talking about today? If this is playing on autoplay in someone's car or in their pocket and they haven't seen the title, what are we talking about today?
Or they don't read. Yeah, so we've been talking a lot, haven't we, about the tattoo traditions of Europe and America, tattooing traditions that I'm sort of particularly an expert in, 19th and 20th century stuff in England and France and Germany and America. But we wanted to, I think, go a bit further afield, talk about a tattoo tradition that was not a European one, but one that was, a little bit out of our usual kind of or recent comfort zone. And so we wanted to talk about a tattoo tradition that is an ancient one that goes back thousands and thousands of years, persists in various forms in contemporary revival movements, for example, in places like Morocco, and that is the tattooing of the Amazigh, or more genuinely known as the Berber people. How much do you know about the Berbers, or do you even know who the Berbers are, Tom? This is an interesting place to start.
I don't know too much about them. I know they are a nomadic people based in North Africa, and that's kind of where I know that they look really cool as well. I've seen quite a lot of amazing photography about Berber tribes, but other than that, very, very little.
So, let's start off with this terminology then, right? So the people who are called the Berbers are a group of different, although again we'll talk about exactly what that means, indigenous groups that sort of spread across the Maghreb, so Morocco, Algeria, Libya, even into places like Mali and Niger. I want to read you the main scholar on this, when I was sort of reading and researching and preparing today, is a scholar called Cynthia Becker, who's written quite a few books and articles about the Berber and the Amazigh that I'm going to be referring to. And she sort of lays out this nomenclature actually in a really interesting way. So she says, during the colonial period, the French contradicted early associations of Berbers with the Middle East. They claimed a native European origin for Berbers and supported the creation of what's been described as the Berber myth. So there was this idea, essentially, that the ethnonym of the Berbers, which basically comes from classical Greek, and it means something like barbarians, basically, not Greek. Some groups of people traditionally called Berbers see the word as a slur actually today, but it's not exclusively. So you do see people using it to describe themselves, but it's a kind of contentious term. And it was one, like with all of these ethnonyms, that the people to whom it applies didn't really use themselves. The other word I've used it already is Amazigh. Amazigh, of which the plural is, let me get this right, Igmazen, Imazigen, is a kind of term that means the free people, and that's the term that these groups now use in a revival sense to kind of create a national identity. So let me quote you Cynthia Becker here. So she says, Amazigh are popularly known as Berbers in North Africa and Tuareg in the Sahara. Some Amazigh activists reject these terms as pejorative labels rooted in the word barbarian and bestowed upon them. They prefer the term Amazigh, of which Amazigh is a singular and adjectival form, which means the free people. Others, in particular activists in France, continue to use the term Berber, as it's the term most familiar in Europe and the United States. Those outside of Northern Africa, they argue that outside of Northern Africa, the pejorative roots of the word Berber remain largely unknown and do not carry the same stigma. During the colonial period, the French contradicted earlier associations of Berbers with the Middle East. They claimed a native European origin for Berbers and supported the creation of a Berber myth. The Berber myth, based on 19th century French encounters with Berbers in the Kabylie region of Algeria, intended to divide the North African population along ethnic lines to make Berbers into allies of French invaders and to encourage them to rally against Arabs. The myth characterized Berbers and Tuareg as only superficially Muslim, more open-minded than the Arabs, and closer both biologically and culturally to Europeans and white Arabs. Ethnologists, often in the employ of the colonial government, strived to find pre-Islamic survivals in almost every part of Berber culture, with the goal of discovering Roman and Christian remnants that would bolster the claim of common Western ancestry. So there's a big group now of activists and descendant populations using that term Amazigh as a kind of identity to, in the words of the Amazigh Cultural Association, represent all Amazigh people regardless of modern country boundaries. It does not represent one particular tribe or country. So essentially, the Amazigh are this group of, as you said, nomadic people who really, have a huge amount of cultural diversity within them. In the contemporary world, they're primarily Arabic speaking and Muslim, although essentially we have kind of accounts of people who seem to resemble this ethnic group right the way back to about 4,000 years ago. So they're a very, very ancient group, and what's really interesting, I think, when we kind of come to the tattooing, one of the things that unites them, and a lot of the scholarship actually, including Becker herself, really kind of join these groups up, across this huge amount of land mass and history, thousands and thousands of years of history in Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, across the Islamic caliphates. And in surviving populations today, the thing that seems to combine them actually is their artistic practice, tattooing in some senses, but also carpet weaving in particular. And art has been, and tattooing as well, which we'll come to later on, I suppose, has become a big part of trying to create and build and edify an identity for the Amazigh people into the 21st century. So again, to quote Cynthia Becker here, despite the marginalization of the Amazigh, academically trained Maghrebi artists in the 1950s and 60s appropriated images derived from Berber ceramics, textiles, tattoos and jewelry in order to create a nationalist art free from European influence. Whilst non-Amazigh artists freely borrowed geometric designs from the Berber artistic repertoire, governmental restrictions prohibited the use of Amazigh symbols by political activists to promote their heritage. However, in recent years, protests in Algeria and Morocco resulted in loosening government restrictions and contributed to the proliferation of self-taught Amazigh painters. Right, so it's really interesting, just as a starting point, right? I think that's really interesting that these people have a kind of ethnic identity foisted upon them by the 19th century. And so for people that don't know, North Africa was colonized largely by the French. And so, as Becca explained there, right, we're putting this marker on them to sort of say, well, they're like us and they're on our side, using kind of the racial politics of ethnic identity. But in the 21st century, we have this kind of revival movement or this defensive movement that's using these kind of broad brushes and these kind of, cynical ideological moves of 19th century colonialism as a way actually of resisting globalization and resisting kind of the hegemonic moves of contemporary, cultural marginalization, which I find super, super interesting.
Yeah, and it's worth also pointing out, I suppose, to explain the impetus behind the way the French categorized people who happen to be their colonial subjects or in the surrounding areas. Like there was a kind of French obsession with kind of ethnographic kind of listing and descriptions and kind of categorization of people into specific ethnic groups, either based on, religion, geography, or simply like social grouping. So you see this kind of replicated throughout, Africa, in Southeast Asia. Yeah, and like, the idea of something like French Indochina, despite the fact there was like multiple different ethnic groups underneath that banner. This is how you get something like Berber being used to describe a big group of people who maybe might not identify with each other in totality, but like the term kind of works for them.
Well, it happens a lot. I mean, art movements, like subcultural groups, like as well as ethnic minorities, they get given these names by the outsiders, and often, as that cliche goes, history's written by the victors. And so you end up with these words. We talked about this in our episode about the Scythians. The same thing. Groups of people who may have had shared kind of, ethnic heritage, but who'd long since formed sort of distinctive, divergent microcultures of their own, over thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of miles and a time spread of thousands of years. But the Greeks and the Romans come along and say, you're all the same people, lads. It's also how we end up with the term Indians for Native Americans, right? That's exactly the same thing. It's just 19th century racists, basically, kind of trying to force everyone together. But it's interesting that, as I said, that it gets it becomes this. It's become this kind of rallying cry for people who have shared resistance to contemporary geopolitics, even though the cultural, the ethnonym, as we call it, was foisted upon them.
Yeah, and it's also as well, I think, in a way that's maybe analogous of like looking at, from an outside perspective, looking at, because we are primarily an art and a history shows, like when you see the visual cultures of someone represented, it's like, oh, how much does something have to be different in order for it to be categorized as distinct by someone who isn't knowledgeable in the visual language of how something is represented? Like, some people to the untrained eye could look at the tattooing of the Berbers and says like, oh, this kind of looks like the stuff they were doing in, Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's like, but it's obviously like a very separate thing. But I suppose before we kind of get into that, let's, take a step back and go back to the actual history of the Berbers.
Yeah, well, so the deep, as I said, the deep history is, maybe even back to 10,000 years BC. There is some sense that perhaps some rock carving, perhaps not intentional, maybe some like footprints that are left in the mud in a cave in the Sahara. A cave basically in like in Algeria. Sorry, in the Sahara. Yeah, in southeastern the southeastern Algerian Sahara. So there's some sense that even in the southeastern part of Algeria and the north of the Sahara Desert, there's some not quite carvings. They're marks that are left in what probably would have been mud left by seemingly children's feet. And we're ending up with, like potential evidence of Berber people or ancestor populations of the Berber going back into deep antiquity, 10,000 BC. And we have, as I said, like huge amounts of archaeology and writing from the Romans, from the Greeks, from the Ottomans, from the early Islamic writers in the 8th and 9th centuries onwards, like to really kind of give these people a huge amount of history across a huge amount of time. They were syncretized with Islamic conquest. That becomes important for the tattoos in a way we'll talk about later on.
The good old Umayyad Caliphate spreading through from the Arabian Peninsula into North Africa and up into Europe through southern Spain. For any of the history heads out there, that is the 7th century onwards.
Like moving basically right through where the Berbers had traditionally lived, and they've been subjected to, as you might imagine, kind of various political and ethnic revolts, and specifically trying to kind of maintain their identity within the modern nation state, I think has been quite complicated as a traditionally nomadic peoples trying to integrate with contemporary society, or the way contemporary society wants to kind of divine nationhood, I think has been particularly quite complicated. But yeah, it's a very, very deep and ancient set of cultures, and the tattooing is one of these things that is very persistent. I think that there's in the sources that I've read, and we'll come to some of them, there's quite a lot of sense that it has been dying out, as a lot of these indigenous tattoo traditions, which were kind of clamped down on in the late 19th, early 20th century, and weren't as visible as they might once have been, but are kind of making a bit of a comeback as attitudes towards tattooing have changed. But tattooing is one of the things I think that has really marked and connected these disparate groups together as a sort of single group. Again, like another chapter by Cynthia Becker called "Deconstructing the History of Berber Arts" sort of goes into this actually in a really interesting way. So she says, few contemporary Berber women practice tattooing, and many but tattooing amongst Berber people is not just amongst women, but it's primarily women who are tattooed, and often on the hands and face. Few contemporary women practice tattooing or wear the heavy silver jewelry and large amber necklaces featured in paintings. The study of Berber artistic production began during the period of French colonization and resulted in the publication of numerous articles and books. Ethnographic studies written during the colonial period by French social scientists and colonial officials typically included discussions of Berber artistic production, buried in chapters on domestic architecture, clothing, labor, birth, and marriage. Colonial scholarship divided Maghrebi art. The Maghreb is basically Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, into urban and rural, and posited urban Arab artistic production as the antithesis of rural Berber arts. Berber arts were divided according to tribal grouping. Each tribe thought to possess a unique style, and a trained eye could recognize a particular tribe's carpets, ceramics, leatherwork, tattooing, and jewelry. Berber arts were described as static, unchanging, and representing pre-Islamic beliefs in animism, magic, and the worship of a female fertility goddess, Tanit. I thought, we've talked about this before on the show as well, but this idea that like Western art gets a timeline and non-Western art and culture gets a place is really indicative in that colonial way of talking about, this is just unchanging over centuries. It doesn't have any kind of stylistic development. It's very kind of primitive, quote unquote. There's a beautiful book which I encourage our listeners to check out called Berber Tattooing in Morocco's Middle Atlas by Felix and Loretta Lou, who visited Morocco in 1988 and basically spent time living with Amazigh Berber people, getting tattooed, observing the tattooing, and documenting in their incredible artistic style the tattoos that they saw. And Loretta says in the introduction to that book basically that what we've just read there too, that quote, in Lausanne I searched for references to Berber tattooing in Morocco. I discovered very few original in the field accounts existed, except for a few articles in French journals between 1915 to 1928. They were written by Jean Herbert, who was a military doctor there during the time when Morocco was a French protectorate. He clearly been intrigued by Berber tattoos in Morocco and documented what he saw in several articles. So if the French colonization was late 19th, early 20th century, there was a lot of French military presence in Algeria and Morocco in that period, and actually also a lot of kind of government-supported military-led anthropology, photography of traditional practices, as well as trying to document tattooing. But what Loretta says there is obviously equivalent to what to that quote from Becker that we read, which was no one's properly studied these, and still hasn't really. I mean, I was looking for some really good quality sources, and there's not a lot out there that was all in one place. There's evidence sort of sprinkled across different academic articles and books and news articles and stuff, but there wasn't kind of one really kind of great resource on this. I think that the Lou book's probably the best one. But we end up with this practice, as you hear here, which is sort of understood to be, animistic, pagan, pre-Islamic, and this becomes, something that you'll recognise from discussions of indigenous tattooing elsewhere in the world, right, Tom?
Yeah, it's like, I think it's really interesting, the tattooing of the Berbers, in that, like, one, it has this kind of continuous thing with a lot of other indigenous tattooing practices of being practiced primarily on women. The kind of interlocking designs adorning like the face and the neck, the kind of visible parts of the body, and also like how it's reflected across all of their creative arts in terms of their textiles, in terms of leather work and etc. And it's really cool, and it's really interesting how it spreads geographically, and there's some small changes in terms of like motifs as you go from place to place, but on the whole it's kind of continuous.
Yeah. One of the people that was doing this kind of colonial recording, actually not a French anthropologist, this is an American, the famous Henry Field. He wrote a book called Body Marking in Southwestern Asia. And obviously we're not in Southwestern Asia, but the book includes some sections about North African tattooing as well. And Field cites a few scholars from this period that we were just talking about, which again is probably worth reading. And one of them is Westermark, the Finnish sociologist who we talked about with Wada al-Sideri when we talked about henna. Westermark in 1933 writes that women in North Africa, quote, have small crosses tattooed on their face, and both men and women have a cross tattooed on the tip of the nose, which as the most projecting part of the body seems a particularly suitable place for such a charm. A Berber friend of mine, whose nose was thus decorated with a cross, told me that the tattooing had been done in infancy because his two elder brothers had died shortly after birth. Persons of either sex are seen with a little cross tattooed on the forefinger of the right hand. This is said to be hateful to God. Such a person should not be allowed to preach in a mosque. An animal killed by him is not good for eating, and after his death, the cross will be obliterated in paradise. Now, we can't take that particularly seriously, right? We talked with Wada about Westermark, and a lot of these guys just sort of, believing what they were told. But there are interesting discussions from the Lou book and also from Becker's work, where contemporary Amazigh people talk about the kind of symbolism or the what we call the apotropeism, the kind of desire of these marks to ward off evil or work in some kind of socially significant way. which brings us to this idea of where tattooing comes into Islam, because Westermark there is trying to make sense of like Christian crosses, what look like Christian crosses on this supposedly Islamic culture. Westermark says the cross is older than Christianity, and so he sort of says, well, maybe. Actually, what Becker reports in a conversation with a man in his 80s. She said the nomads learned from people who traveled from the Sahara and passed time in the desert. Nomads learned about Islam from them. And when nomadic populations began to settle in the towns, increased exposure to Islamic teaching caused this group called the Ait Kabash, which are a Amazigh grouping in Morocco. That Becker interviews, says, abandon the practice of tattooing the faces of adolescent girls. Fatima, an Ait Kabash woman in her 50s with facial tattoos, recited an Arabic song condemning tattooed women that she recounted being sung 10 years earlier. God insults the women who do tattoos, the women with tattoos, and the women who rest near them. He insults the wall near them. Why doesn't it fall on the tattooed women? Another interview subject with Becca says, I was around 12 years old. A neighbor did the tattoo for me. I asked her to do it for me. She painted the design on my chin and forehead with charcoal, then pricked my chin with a needle. It really hurt. When she pricked my lip, it was like someone was poking the whites of my eyes with a needle. She went over it 3 times and put alfalfa on the marks. I wrapped up my chin and left the alfalfa on it for 3 days to make sure it became green. I wouldn't let her tattoo my forehead then because the first one hurt too much. And then Becca says, although scholars describe Moroccan tattoos as blue-black, Ait Kabash women told me the best tattoos were deep green. So this is there, right? This idea that tattooing, in some senses, connects the Amazigh to their pre-Islamic heritage, even as the Islamic influences were trying to cast it out. Westermark and this is one of the things that these Christian colonialists were trying to sort of point out, that they, there was a kind of pre-Christian culture or a pre-Islamic culture that linked these people to Christianity, and maybe all the crosses in their tattoos linked them to Christianity.
But also,
it's way more complicated. It's way more complicated than that.
But I think, like that point on it being complicated, like that is, if you look at the history of North Africa, just outside of the spread of Islam from the 7th century onwards, like the history of North Africa is like very complex, and like the representations and like how religion, politics, and culture manifests across the region is really complex. And even in the Maghreb, like the exposure to European trade quite early, to the Greeks, to the Romans, and like onwards, and kind of constantly there is like influx of influence from all of the surrounding regions. It's not quite, if you ask an African, they might say that, Morocco is in Africa. You ask a European, they might say it's Europe. You ask someone from Jordan, well, it's not necessarily part of the Arab world. It kind of exists in this kind of in-between place, and it kind of makes sense then that the Amazigh people will, especially as I think is continuous with a lot of nomadic peoples, is that there's kind of a level of cultural exchange and adoption depending on where you kind of end up, in order to exist in a society that you're not necessarily fully a part of, but you exist within. So it's like, okay, we will have some blending of like whatever the dominant culture is in the region that we live in, and we still have our own personal cultures that allow it to kind of survive through time.
Yeah, and I think there's this instinct, right, by Western anthropologists and even people like us who are looking at this from the outside, and a kind of instinct I try and avoid as much as I can, to try and kind of reduce this stuff to sort of simple iconography, to X image means Y thing. And of course it can do, but meaning is just as fluid, obviously, in Amazigh culture as it is in European culture, right? Like, some images will be fixed or more or less fixed and have kind of straightforward symbolisms, but others will be more fluid. Felix Liu himself said, quote, tattoos seem to have no meanings apart from being pictograms of things. But again, Becker in another article, I found all these different articles and I realized they were all by the same person. There's just one excellent scholar of Amazigh art and culture. Becker says, my own research on Amazigh textiles, and this is an article that she wrote for Yale about the carpets. My own research on Amazigh textiles included intense discussions about motifs, patterns, and colors with women themselves. I found the names given to these designs varied greatly, but they were seen as protective symbols or motifs that drew from the natural environment and were associated with fertility and abundance. Among the former is a motif of a half circle with 5 finger-like oblong projections meant to resemble a hand. Hand motifs are believed to protect against the evil eye because they reference the number 5. Other motifs resemble stylized plant-like forms and serve as fertility symbols. When a girl reached puberty, she had similar designs tattooed on her ankles, hands, and face, indicating she was of marriageable age. Whilst Amazigh women no longer practice tattooing, the association of these patterns with fertility, both in textiles and tattoos, indicated that social respect granted to women was related to their ability to have children and their role as mothers. Right. And there's quite a lot of this discussion too across the various sources. Some of these, again, I love them because this is the kind of thing that an anthropologist wouldn't really take this as an answer, but a tattoo artist will. Under loads of these drawings, Loretta's written, Aisha says, no meaning, ornamental, designed from carpet. No meaning, from carpet, ornamental. No meaning, designed from carpet. Right? This is this kind of connection, this continuity with broader visual culture, which I've talked about all the time. And one of the things that I think does allow us to think about the medium of tattooing as an image, as a way of image making in a life world. It's really instinctive a lot of the time by anthropologists to go, what does it mean? And actually, these people are going, nah, it's just cool. That said, there are ones, there's one that they record which looks like a kind of comb, a street with trees, meaning magic and charm. God will show you the right way out of a problem. And there are various other discussions about, ideas of the evil eye or about again, the evil eye, the sawmill cut the enemy in half, but others are meant to look nice, like just for beauty.
This is the point I was about to make, is that I think when particularly studying the art of indigenous cultures or indeed, cultures that we're unfamiliar with, it's like, I think everyone is a bit too overeager to ascribe kind of like a talismanic element to whatever art, whether it's, physical adornment in terms of tattoos, ways of dress, patterns of speech, that like all these things have this kind of meaning more than the function that they serve. And it could simply be, the tattoos that exist as adornment as self-described by the people who have them. Yes, they might be, self-decoration, but it's also communicating belonging to a group simply by having them.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's something, again, which we can share. I mean, that brings me really nicely, actually, to another amazing article I'd not read before. I don't know how I'd missed it. It's a really beautiful article called, in English translation, Tattoos Writing in Dots, written originally in French, Tatouage écriture en point, by a Moroccan-French writer called Abdelbakir Kadapi. It's from a book of experimental intersemiotics called La blessure du nom propre, the wound of the proper name, from 1974. And it's this like proper 1970s French theoretical semiotic reading, semiotic meaning the science of how meaning is made, of Moroccan, North African, Arab and Arabic proverbs, tattoos and calligraphy. It's a really, really beautiful, beautiful piece of writing that, as I said, somehow had escaped me.
Actually, before you go into it, that's actually a phenomenal point that I'd actually never really thought about, is that like tattoos are almost like visual colloquialisms to that they, I have, certain sayings that I heard growing up that I might say to someone and they would have a different interpretation of them. But like, yeah, the tattoos in terms of like semiotics, it's like a visual colloquialism to each other.
That's exactly it, right? And meaning is made by recognition and shared, shared kind of recognition of some kind of mutual intelligibility, right? It's really, really beautiful. So there's some great phrases in here. So this is a section where he's talking about different words: stigma from the Greek, the mark of hot iron, stitzo, to prick or mark or burn with a hot iron, wakma. Encyclopedia Dictionary Lisan al-Arab gives the following remarks. Wakma indicates a tattoo that a woman makes on her arms, the lines of the gazelle, a needle coated with burned fat, a temporary tattoo done with henna. We say wakmat al-ad, the earth tattooed itself with it when grass grows. Likewise, the sky when lightning flashes, or by analogy, a girl when her breasts begin to grow. When I say that there's wakam between you and me, this means there is a conflict between us, the trace of evil forces, a desire to move like a palimpsest. Wakma is close to the root of wasma, to brand or vasm, which leads to the supposition there's a close connection between human tattooing and the proprietary sacrifice of a newly born animal from the herd during pilgrimage to Mecca. Metaphoric chain generalizes writing to an anthropomorphic level. So like this idea that just the words that we use to describe this practice has all these resonance in different cultures. In Greek, stigma, this marking and branding, as we've talked about before, linking to the marks on a snake, but the word in Arabic, vakma, has this sort of sense of transformation or kind of, shared conflict or something, which I find really, really fascinating. I've been teaching a module on semiotics this year, so it was really nice to come across this.
Well, I think it's as well thinking about the semiotics and like those descriptions. I also think it, in a way, it serves a quite functional role as well. Like particularly when you have nomadic groups existing within a culture that like might travel from one area to another. It's also it's almost like a passport. Like,
yeah,
it's a sign of mutual recognition between people crossing paths.
Well, I wanted to kind of give the point you made a sort of proper scientific terminology, because again, this is summarized really nicely in this article. So the production of a piece of fabric is guided by two movements: a social idiolect, in which several signs suffice to produce a local semiotic system. So that's what you're talking about. Idiolect is a sort of locally shared language, tribal semiotics, and a personal idiolect, the style of the person making the tattoo. A repertory of signs such as this, which is often without meaning, does not seem to obey any rule prescribing the location on the body. It's the idiolect that describes. So we have the idiolect, which is the local intelligible symbol system, and then the personal idiolect, which is like how you as an individual artist express that in a way that speaks to your unique personality. And this is again what Abdulbakir Kabati calls the subverted body in this discussion, with an image of an Amazigh woman that he's drawn, and it's a really fantastic, careful piece of writing by someone from sort of within this cultural tradition to some degree, obviously, because it allows us to kind of think about meaning and symbolism and things without being reductive. Something that obviously the Lus understand as tattooers and tattooed people, but which a lot of these anthropologists, and certainly the earlier ones, people like Westermarck and Field and the French anthropologists that we've talked about, like, want to basically say, what does this symbol mean? This symbol means this. This symbol means that.
It's also, as well, I think, a failure of how some people have engaged with this stuff, and I think some people still do engage with this stuff, is that like all of these things only serve one primary function. This does one thing, therefore its meaning or the intention behind its application must mean this one direct thing that is intelligible to me, rather than it being kind of like a layered system of intention behind, the textiles, the leatherwork, the tattoos, the language, how, these things exist as like kind of stacks of idiolects, essentially.
100%. Yeah, exactly. A bit more specific stuff on this. This is what Becca says. Particular motifs comprise of a variety of geometric designs. They vary from group to group in Morocco, allowing a woman to express ethnic identity publicly and permanently. The Ait Kabash women I encountered felt their tattoos continued an ancient artistic tradition into the present and evoked the proverb, do what the first ones did. Whilst most scholars would agree tattoos have been a means of expressing ethnic identity, there's very little agreement concerning the name significance of individual tattoo designs. Although they did not have a specific name for the patterns they used on their foreheads, Ait Kabash women tattooed two straight diagonal lines that crossed each other at the top, creating two V-shaped chevrons with three straight lines that radiated from the sides of the larger bottom one and three small dots that hovered above the entire composition. I'll screenshot this and we can put it on Instagram so people can see this. This was a interview done in the late 90s. This tattoo style allowed a woman to be identified as Ait Kabash, and variations among groups shows an Amazigh woman has a different tattoo that distinguishes her as a member of a particular group. So these are marks which allow you to be, the colonial flattening says these people are all the same, but within the local individual groupings and histories, the individual designs serve to kind of indicate where you're from in the world or where you're from in the region. And these things will also change generationally, right? Like unlike this colonial idea of static, folk art, unchanging, quote unquote primitive, we end up with a tradition that's very, 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 very layered and complicated. I wanted to read you. There's a lovely description here again from Felix and Loretta about how it was done. This was a woman called Kabira. She tells us her tribe was called Ait Uai, and her husband's tribe was Ait Azuz. This is in the late 80s. The placement of tattoos was the choice of each individual, and her tattoos were done by her mother at 18 after her marriage. She said she's a medicine woman and midwife and tattooist, and only women were tattooists, although not all tattooists were medicine women or midwives. How she tattooed. She mixed a little water in a glass with soot and spit. The little ones only spit, for big ones water and spit. And using a tuft of sheep's wool, she mixed the water and soot and applied it onto the skin. She didn't bandage the tattoo after it was done, and if it became inflamed or swollen, she used a plant called tirinit on it. The plant was fresh, crushed between her palms, and the juice applied on the tattoo. She told us she never had a case of infection all her life, and she'd even tattooed over cysts, and they'd disappeared. Felix reflected, the landscape is flat, rolling hills, earth and sky, no views, no scenery, so people have to fill the emptiness with tattoos, which again comes back to that lovely semiotic description earlier on as well about the tattoo emerging out of the body like the vegetation out of the land.
And this kind of brings me, I suppose, to a point that I wanted to talk about as like one of the impetuses for us doing this episode is I'd seen recently a kind of discourse around indigenous tattoo revival movements in terms of like taking older practices that may have fallen out of popularity and trying to, bring them back to the fore. And one of the central questions that always comes up with these movements is like, who are these tattoos for? Are they exclusively for the groups of people who have practiced them? Or is this like a kind of throwing open the doors that like this is a artistic practice that is worth surviving? And I was thinking about it a lot because there's a lot of very interesting like indigenous Irish, old kind of Irish crafts and craftsmanship that had fallen out of the wayside due to colonialism and due to, I suppose, the modernization of technology and they became unnecessary because mechanical reproduction is easier. It's easier to make stuff in a industrial process, and it's kind of like these practices, if they are brought back intentionally and you try to repopularize them, what do you do if the place they're from is unreceptive to them? Like, who do you tattoo?
Yeah, I think it's really complicated, right? And in some senses, the answer will be distinct from each individual local context. And I think, very early on in the show, we did an amazing interview with Maya Sialuk Jakobsen, who talked about her work reviving Inuit tattooing in Greenland, and the revival of Inuit tattooing, which had basically been completely wiped out and was being rehabilitated and rediscovered and researched by her and others, almost from scratch. It's different to something like, again, the discussion which we can go back and listen to that we had with Teirangitu about tattooing in New Zealand, where tattooing amongst Maori wasn't completely. I mean, it was suppressed. Don't get me wrong, but it never completely went away, and there is a continuous set of knowledges, and the discussions about the revival of that in the 90s was very different. And we've seen discussions about Ainu tattooing in the Ainu diaspora, both in Japan and in the United States. I think it varies from place to place, and it's very controversial. What's interesting in the specific case of this Maghrebian kind of Amazigh Berber tattooing is just how integrated with the political movements it's been. So there was a group in Algeria called the Alchem, which is derived from one of these words in Arabic for tattooing. And they were founded in the 1960s as a kind of explicit political movement at a time, when we were coming up to the Algerian War. There was a big push for independence of the North African French colonies and the armed conflict that was happening in the aftermath of Vietnam in North Africa. And for example, the Alchem in Algeria, after Algerian independence, an Arabization campaign was launched to replace French, the official language during the colonial period, and to restore an Algerian identity that was denied during 132 years of French colonization. This is again from an article by Becker. The government controlled artistic production. In 1963, it formed a National Union of Plastic Arts. So, in order to respond to this, to counter the oppressive control, this group Alchem, which means tattoo in Arabic, was co-founded by Algerian artists Denis Martinez and Chukri Melissa. The short-lived group exhibited work between 67 and 71, filled with geometric motifs borrowed from Berber art as part of an effort to return Algerian art to its roots and realize the group's goal of employing indigenous motifs to capture an authentic spirit of Algeria. And this is, again, something that the contemporary Amazigh political movements argue. They sort of acknowledge that the ethnonym was foisted upon them, but actually the oppression that was wrought by the homogenization of those disparate ethnic groups, the fact they were all treated the same by colonialism, means they have a shared struggle in resistance. And so tattooing for contemporary Amazigh revival groups, it seems, at least according to these articles that I've read, basically think about tattooing as a way of celebrating and literally kind of embodying the kind of culture that was taken away or resisted by French colonization in the first place. And I think that's really interesting, and I think it's something that I think also you've seen in some of the Inuit tattoo movements, some of the Native American tattoo movements, right, where tattooing is quite different and quite distinct from its original, meaning and cultural context, but it takes on a different form given its relationship to colonialism. It's really, really fascinating, actually. Because there's also this, this idea that, of course, Amazigh Berber groups, many of them don't see themselves as Arab either. Well, they're not Arab either. Not they don't see themselves if they aren't Arab either. And so they're really trying to find an identity label or a cultural kind of politics that is distinct both from white Christians and from Arabic influence. So in Morocco, says Becca, Amazigh activists have attempted to expel evidence of Arabization from their culture by reforming their language so it does not contain Arab words and adopting a local script called Tifanga. An artist who called Fouad Lahib, an activist, artist, and writer, exhibits under the name Yeshu, creates abstract calligraphic signs that are based on the Tifang script and what he refers to as ancestral signs, such as tattoos and textile motifs. So I think that's super interesting and, not straightforward in terms of where the mythologies and where the cultural boundaries and who gets ownership over what. It's really, really difficult. But that's what makes this stuff so interesting, I think.
Yeah, and it's also, it dispels that kind of post-colonial anthropological viewpoint of like indigenous practices have a place and not a time. It's the process and development is alive and it's active and there's discourse around it, and it's like this proves that these things are still alive and there's people who still care.
And all history, of course, is a kind of process of discursive myth making, right? Like all history functions like that, and I think kind of making that visible is part of an interesting agentic move. I mean, again, another artist that she talks about, Mohammed Eziani, basically says Eziani creates an inventory of Amazigh designs that replicates charts of tattoo motifs commonly found in colonial era publications. Whilst this can be interpreted as an act of self-exoticizing myth-making, because, the links to these prehistories are not straightforward. At the same time, Eziani displays agency by establishing his own version of Amazigh history, right? So Eziani's work is basically painterly, like painting landscapes with buildings decorated with these kind of designs, amongst other things. So, yeah, I mean, it's something which I really sort of encourage people to read more about. As you will have got the sense from, I'm in no way an expert in this. And I never want to claim to be, but it's something that's really interesting. I have noticed. I mean, you mentioned the interesting visual similarities with some of the Central European Christian tattooing, where one must imagine there's some syncretization happening there. Like those things, the tattooing in Bosnia, for example, in the Middle Ages and slightly afterwards, certainly seem to show design similarities which suggest some kind of cultural exchange. I don't know enough about that either off the top of my head to say exactly how plausible that is. But I have noticed that these blackwork designs, this visual system, has been appropriate is probably too strong. I don't think people are actively appropriating it, and if they are, they probably shouldn't. But the kind of visual sense of the designs, I think, are something that people are finding really interesting. And given that it's not so, like, it's not as integrated into the sociology of Amazigh culture as, let's say, Maori tattooing is with Maori culture. I don't know what the appropriation question is, how people are going to fall on that. I think it's probably a bit more. A bit less. I don't want to say dogmatic. A lot less doctrinal. About who gets to wear what tattoos. I don't, from my, as I said, albeit limited reading, I don't get the sense that it's quite the same thing as many Pacific tattoo traditions in terms of who gets to wear these symbols. But I would really encourage people not to copy tattoos from cultures that they're not from, if you're thinking about that.
Yeah. And I think, that's a good place to end it. I'm sorry to anyone who thought they were going to get a very A to B history on the history of the Berbers or Amazigh people. As as a whole, I feel like we had a very interesting discussion that was much more in our wheelhouse, in that we have kind of a bit more authority to talk about. But with that in mind, I want to say thank you very much for listening. If you want to get more tattoo history, you can look at Instagram and search Beneath Skin Pod, or you can listen to the back catalogue. We hope maybe you might be a new listener. We've been running for 3.5 years at this stage. We also have a Patreon where you can hear more interesting stuff there behind the paywall. And with that out of the way, it's thank you and goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Thank you. As always, we love you. We love you all. Bye-bye.